What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. Just caught The Disaster Artist, a movie directed by and starring James Franco, and it's based on a book of precisely the same name. The book is The Disaster Artist, My Life Inside the Room, the greatest bad movie ever made. Now, this book was co-written by Greg Sestero, who had the honor and the privilege of co-starring in The Room alongside the very enigmatic, mysterious Tommy Wiseau. Now, there's definitely an intense cult following for The Room. This movie came out in like 2003 or 2004, and it is one of those movies that's so poorly put together, but at the same time so earnest and sincere that you can't help but love the intentions of Tommy Wiseau, even if you are constantly laughing at the movie's expense due to his inept line readings or lack of continuity or random subplots. I've never necessarily been one of those people that loves watching bad movies just so I can point at them and laugh at them. I'd much rather watch good movies, but I totally understand that there's a massive audience out there that really loves watching, Ed Wood movies from the 50s or super low budget Roger Corman sci-fi movies because they enjoy the mistakes. And sometimes I feel like it can get a little snarky and a little bit too cool for school or too hipster. On the other hand, I'll never stand in the way of people watching movies because they love the experience or love sharing that experience with their friends. And I think that's one of the things that has kept The Room alive all these years because it is absolutely hysterical at times. But also for people who aspire to making movies, or even to people who are wildly successful in movies, guys like James Franco and Seth Rogen, I think they can't help but be fascinated by this guy because Tommy Wiseau is one of these guys where you're not quite sure how old he is or where he's from or where his money's coming from, but he's pursuing the Hollywood dream of making the great American movie. And in the end, if you set out to make a movie on your own, and that movie is watched for many years after, I mean, that is basically what Hollywood's all about. But I feel like Tommy Wiseau, in a lot of ways, kind of embodies what Hollywood's all about. Like, everything in your life prior to arriving there is totally irrelevant. You can completely manufacture and build a new identity from the ground up. Granted, it helps that he has vast sums of money tucked away, and no one's quite sure where the money comes from, but a lot of LA is about reinventing yourself, and Tommy Wiseau reinvents himself as an actor and a director, even though he has no ability or experience on either front, and successfully made a movie that people are still talking about a decade and a half later. We might poke fun at him, we might laugh at him, but the fact remains 99.99% of independent movies disappear into complete and total obscurity, never to be seen or heard from again, and people are still talking about The Room. I mean, movie stars are making movies about them, so maybe people won't laugh quite as maliciously at The Room moving forward. But what's interesting about The Disaster Artist, I feel like this is the first sign of the next wave of nostalgia, and it's going to be 90s and early 2000s nostalgia. I feel like right now we're getting a massive tidal wave of early 80s nostalgia. I mean, shows like Stranger Things are completely cashing in on people's obsession with early 80s John Carpenter or early 80s Stephen King novels, and I lived through that era, and I love all those books and movies from that period, so I totally get it. But at a certain point, that wave's going to crash and pull back, and people will get a little sick of 80s nostalgia. I mean, who knows, like Ready Player One, which is a big Steven Spielberg movie coming out in the spring, that totally is cashing in on rampant 80s nostalgia, even if it is a futuristic sci-fi movie. And I feel like at a certain point, people are going to be over it, and they're going to look for other decades to be nostalgic about. So the 90s, it's on deck, and The Disaster Artist definitely captures a unique moment in time in the late 90s and early 2000s. And for me, it was kind of a nostalgic trip down memory lane because in the late 90s, I first started interning out in LA, and in the early 2000s, I was dabbling in the world of independent films. In the summer of 2003, I was one of the producers on a super micro-budget horror movie called Dead Doll. You can look it up on IMDb. It's Dead Doll from 2004, a straight-to-video horror movie. And it is not one of those bad movies that people are talking about many years later. It's one of the bad movies that just went whew, and just washed away into nothingness. But I remember seeing these billboards. I think the billboard was on La Brea of just The Room with Tommy Wiseau and that classic strange expression with the kind of lazy twisted eye. And I remember just never quite knowing what the hell it was all about. And that billboard just stayed up there. It just wouldn't go away. And I feel like it stayed there for like 2 or 3 years, but it never even occurred to me to actually hunt down that movie until around 2005, 2006. I started hearing people talking about it at parties and talking about how funny it was. And even then, I just never really got into it because it seemed like more often than not, it was people who weren't into movies who seemed way too pleased with themselves having discovered it and being able to laugh at it. And so I just totally disregarded it. And so it took me many, many years before I finally actually hunted down The Room. But I have to admit, when I finally saw it, there are some scenes that are unimaginably funny. And a large part of the fun of The Disaster Artist is watching James Franco tap into them. I mean, James Franco just hurls himself into becoming Tommy Wiseau, and I feel like he does it in a very good-natured way. I mean, they appear in talk shows together, and they seem to have become friends to a degree, or as much as you can become friends with somebody who is just pathologically dishonest about their past and who they are. Also, if you want the mystery of Tommy Wiseau to be sustained, don't look him up on IMDb, because sadly, IMDb has been able to discover some of the crucial details of his bio, including his date of birth and his country of origin, which for me shatters like 95% of the fun of Tommy Wiseau. I still don't know where all of his money comes from, but James Franco really seems to have disappeared inside the skin of this guy. And more often than not, throughout the movie, I was howling in laughter. I mean, James Franco just knocked it out of the park. Where I have some grievances, perhaps, is with the directing style of James Franco, in that the main character is such an edgy, weird, strange, unconventional character. I was kind of hoping for an edgy, weird, unconventional, strange movie, and the movie's just not. I mean, it's shot in kind of a documentary style or cinema verite style, a lot of handheld cameras and that sort of thing. But in the end, it feels like a Hollywood movie in terms of the arc, the structure, the relationships, the choice of music throughout the movie. I mean, if you enjoy the movies that are written by or produced by Seth Rogen, James Franco, their whole circle of friends, then you're probably going to enjoy The Disaster Artist. I guess I was just a little disappointed that they decided to play it so safe in such a conventional Hollywood fashion when they're tackling such a bizarre subject like Tommy Wiseau. The movie really soars when it shows just how unprepared and naive Tommy Wiseau was going into making this movie, but Hollywood is always happy to take your money. I mean, I feel like it's a lot like Vegas. I mean, if an independent producer shows up and they've got limitless wealth, crew will go to work for them, and vendors will sell equipment to them. And you see him basically learning how to make a movie while spending millions upon millions of dollars just making crucial errors. Like at one point he decides that he wants to shoot in 35mm and an HD side by side at the same time. Something nobody was doing, something nobody recommended, but he thought it sounded kind of edgy because he wasn't quite sure, as it turns out, what the difference was between HD and 35. And so boom, you just see the budget ballooning by making these kind of choices. Also just his lack of confidence as an actor, or his lack of professionalism as an actor, just simple scenes and simple lines of dialogue stretch into days and into weeks, and it's like a 40-day shoot that stretches into like 55 or 60 days. Now, my main grievance against the movie, and I don't know if it's a grievance that everybody's going to share, but I had a really tough time with Dave Franco as Greg, the friend of Tommy. Dave Franco has the misfortune of being the less talented younger brother of James Franco, and who knows, maybe he will evolve and grow over time, but when they're on screen together, and it's quite a lot because the friendship of these two guys is very much the heart of the story, I got real tired of hearing Dave Franco speak by about the halfway point. He doesn't have as much range, and also maybe it's just because of the fact that the character is just not remotely as interesting as Tommy. But as the story progresses, they start having more and more confrontations, and watching these two guys argue, it just wasn't that much fun, and it wasn't dramatically compelling. So this is one of those movies where I don't think I could watch it from start to finish again. I could definitely watch individual scenes, because there are individual scenes that are funny as hell. But Dave Franco definitely kind of weighed on the movie in a lot of ways. He definitely holds it back like an anchor. That may not hold true for everybody. Some people might find Dave Franco's performance just fine. It just didn't quite work for me. But my hat is off to James Franco for attempting this material. I mean, it seems like he's making a sincere, concerted effort to tell stories as a director outside of his typical comfort zone. I didn't necessarily see anything in The Disaster Artist that that blew me away in terms of his skills as a director. However, his performance is so magnetic and so captivating, it definitely was worth the price of admission. I mean, I was cackling wildly throughout probably half the movie, and that is saying something. So it'll be interesting to see if The Disaster Artist kind of ruins the spell that has made The Room such a beloved cult classic up to this point. I mean, I feel like when you're part of a group of people that loves and admires an obscure movie, a movie like The Disaster Artist might take away some of that joy, because all of a sudden a bunch of new posers will get in on the action, and I imagine the people who have been watching and laughing at The Room since the early 2000s might be like, oh, well, you're a bunch of Johnny-come-latelys, like, you don't even really belong here. On the other hand, I feel like Tommy Wiseau, who always just wanted to be a star, wanted to be recognizable, he definitely has achieved his lifelong dream. Seeing Tommy Wiseau on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, still telling lies, still putting up a smokescreen about his identity, It's absolutely hysterical to see that this guy's been able to sustain this persona for as long as he has. And probably the best part of the movie is at the very end, during the credits, they decide to do side-by-side comparisons of James Franco's recreations of scenes from The Room alongside the actual scenes from The Room. And it is uncanny in terms of the camera angles, the lighting, the shot composition, even the way people deliver the lines. I mean, they really went all out to do a loving tribute to The Room. So while I would never in a million years consider myself part of the cult surrounding The Room, I did thoroughly enjoy seeing The Disaster Artist. And if James Franco ends up getting some love around award season for his portrayal of Tommy Wiseau, I would have no trouble with that whatsoever. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed my review. Definitely hunt down The Room. I mean, you can go on YouTube and just watch highlights and laugh your ass off for a good 10-15 minutes. You do not need to have a working knowledge of The Room to enjoy The Disaster Artist. It tells you all you need to know. So I hope you've enjoyed my review. Please consider giving my channel a subscribe. If you want to talk more, the best place to find me is always on Twitter @Colbrax, or you can leave a comment in the comments below. But I hope all y'all have an amazing weekend, and I'll talk to y'all soon.